Delighted to welcome two key members of the General Assembly to This Week in Virginia to talk about a very important issue that they've been championing throughout the session. That is the abolishment of capital punishment. Senator Scott Surovell, who served in the House of Delegates back 2010-16 and now been in the Senate since 2016, representing parts of Fairfax County, Prince William, and Stafford counties. And Delegate Mike Mullin, who came into the House of Delegates in the fall of 2016, representing parts of James City and York counties, and then also part of Newport News. And you all are the chief patrons of the bills. You have some co-chief patrons, quite a few in the House and one in the Senate, but you're the leaders on this very important issue. And thank you very much. Angel Minor is my co-host, and she's going to start with the first question and then get you all into telling our viewers about the legislation and about as it moves along. So Angel, you start us off.
Thank you. And thank you for joining. My first question is, when was the last execution in the state of Virginia?
The last execution, that was, I think, about 4 years ago. I think it was William Morva. Is that right, Mike?
That's right.
But I think he was convicted in early 2010, 11, 12, something like that. But the execution didn't take place until about 3 or 4 years ago.
It was actually the last death sentence was issued 11 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Let me take you back to the 1970s. That's way back. And when the Supreme Court ruled, there was a predecessor of you all in the House of Delegates, and I had a delightful conversation with him earlier this week, Sam Glasscock of Suffolk, who really pushed and championed this issue. Sam is so excited. I wanted me to give my congratulations to you and your colleagues as it's moving forward. Sam said, I must not have been effective back in the late 1970s. I said, Sam, you were just a voice crying in the wilderness. But it has certainly taken a time since the 1970s to 2021. So tell us about this journey during this session and about the challenges and where you are right now in the legislation. Mike, if you want to start, and then we'll go to Scott.
Well, Virginia's had a long and I would say difficult history with capital punishment. You know, the first execution that ever occurred on English-speaking soil occurred here in Jamestown. And since then, we have executed a huge number of individuals. In fact, what we've found is that nationwide since 1973, as you were mentioning, there have been 170 exonerations for people who were on death row. So I think that's one of the key things that has always struck me about the death penalty. Scott and I both work in the criminal justice system on a daily basis. He is a defense attorney and I as a prosecutor. And I think we can both say that we have an amazing criminal justice system here in the country. I would say it's the best in the world, but we get things wrong often. Any statistic that you look at, it's between 2 and 10% of all verdicts are wrong. And so, I mean, that keeps me up at night right now. And I've never put anyone to death. You know, the possibility of being wrong is something that we need to recognize as part of our criminal justice system. And so for me, that journey is an acknowledgement that people are fallible and that our system is made up of people.
And Scott, how did you get into this battle to abolish capital punishment?
Well, David, you know, my views on capital punishment, I think, sort of crystallized probably around the time when I was in college. Right after my senior year of college, I became a governor's fellow under Governor Wilder. And one of the things we did when we were governor's fellows, we took field trips to various state facilities. And one of the places that they decided to show off to us was the death chamber in the Greenville State Penitentiary, which in 1983 was actually brand new. And that was back before Virginia had lethal injection. So they actually took us to show us the electric chair. And we got a tour of the electric chair, and it was pretty agonizing for me to go and look at that and see it and have to think about how many people had been put to death in that thing. And I went to law school right after that, and with what I learned in law school about due process and our criminal justice system and fairness and everything else, and it just, to me, it became very clear very fast where I thought we should go as a country and as a Commonwealth. I think our Commonwealth journey has been a very long and sordid one. I mean, as Mike pointed out, the first person was executed in 1608 here, and our Commonwealth has executed more people than any other governmental entity in the United States of America. We're number 2 after Furman v. Georgia was reinstituted. And, our state's history with this is not a proud one at all. In fact, executions really started to tick up in Virginia after lynching was basically shut down. And Tim Kaine has an excellent article where he points out that for a long period of time in our state, there were many crimes that the death penalty only applied if you were African American. And I think this process has been a real reckoning for a lot of people in the state. And I think a lot of people have really started to recognize the inequities with it. Mike, pointed out the innocence issue, and that one is really one that nobody has an argument against. I mean, in this whole process, I've never heard anybody explain how a moral and just society can justify executing a few innocent people just to have this remedy on the books in case we need it. It's not justifiable.
Sam Glasscock reminded me that when this bill was being debated on the floor of the House in the late 1970s, that the comment was made, just as you were making, each of you were making, about the errors that can happen and that someone can be executed who was innocent. And one of the members of the House spoke up and said, well, I doubt that happens very often. And Sam said there was just a groan in the House when that comment was made. Let me ask you, the Lawson Center at Christopher Newport had a survey came out very recently, and it showed that we're divided on this issue. We're divided, those who identify themselves as Democrats and Republicans. We're divided, those who are black and those who are white. How do you explain this to someone who might say, why are some people who identify themselves one way on one side of the issue, and then so many who identify themselves another way on the other side of the issue? Because in a way, it doesn't seem like it's a D or an R or even necessarily a black or white issue. Well,
David, I appreciate what you were saying about the Lawson Center study, but that Lawson Center study shows that almost 60% of Virginians want to abolish the death penalty. So yes, there are people of goodwill on both sides of this issue. And I think the debate that we saw in the Senate and on the House is that people of goodwill can disagree. And that I think that there was a lot of very healthy, mature, and thoughtful debate on this issue. But I have to say, I honestly think the General Assembly is just catching up to the people of Virginia. Over 2/3 of the localities in the Commonwealth haven't executed someone in 50 years. The vast majority of executions come from 3 jurisdictions here in the Commonwealth, and there has not been a Virginia jury who has handed down a death sentence in 11 years. That's not because of lack of opportunity. They've chosen not to do it. It turns out when given the opportunity to put someone to death, Virginians don't want to do it any longer. And so really the General Assembly's, a decade late to the party.
Yeah, and David, I think Mike's largely right about that. And I think interestingly, I think our juries also stopped giving out capital punishment or capital sentences once we started properly funding indigent defense once we started a capital defender's office and really started funding indigent defense the way we should, which highlights one inequity of the whole thing. But public opinion has really changed. And, one of the real problems with that is that when 60% of the public opposes this as a punishment, it becomes I think, nearly impossible to actually have a fair jury, because one of the questions they ask you when you want to serve on a capital jury is, could you impose a death sentence? And when 60% of your people say, I can't do that, I don't know how we can comport with our constitutional requirement to give people a jury of their peers. Constitution, both the state constitution and the federal constitution, requires you to have a jury of your peers. And when 60% of them can't sit because they don't agree with the punishment, you end up getting a jury of 40%, which isn't really a jury of your peers. And so it doesn't really comport with our system of justice anymore. And I think this whole discussion, I think part of the reason you see the partisan divide in it is, I think the African American community has one experience and set of expectations, and they have clear feelings about how the death penalty has been used, but it's also been, I think, tied into the criminal justice reform movement. There's definitely been a partisan divide on that. That's part of it. I also know, at least on the Senate side, we had some of my Republican colleagues who were really struggling with it because of their religious views. It's definitely an issue that I think Democrats more closely identify with than with abolition, that is, than Republicans. But there are definitely people on both sides. I think they had much more of a bipartisan vote on the House side, I think, than the Senate side. But we had some senators that were really struggling with it. I had members telling me they were going to vote for it, and then they backed out, and then they're in and out. And it really conflicts a lot of people.
Angel, I think you had another question to ask about inmates, current inmates.
Yes. For when this bill is passed, what happens to the inmates that are already on death row? Are there any inmates on death row?
Yeah, there's two of them, and they will both get life without parole.
Okay.
But there's two people that are still on death row.
It illustrates, I think, the points that you were making, that there are only two. Because I imagine it, and if you take snapshots of previous years and go back a decade, there would have been far more than two.
Yeah, but David, one of the things I think it's important to understand is that, according to the data that the Sentencing Commission gave to me, capital charges have been filed over 60 times in the last 5 years. So even though there's only two on death row, the prosecutors across the state have attempted to at least start the process 60 times over a 5-year period, or about 12 times a year, about one every month. And often when the capital punishment is asserted, it ends up resulting in plea negotiations or a plea deal. And I don't know how many of those 60 went to trial, but there's no question the juries have been rejecting it. There was a very prominent trial in Prince William County last year, or 2 years ago, where a lot of people thought the jury was going to give a capital punishment, but they didn't. But it's not, it's still trying to be used, but it just hasn't been successful in almost 10 years now.
I think one of the things that was referenced a little earlier by Scott that's important about this is the experience of the African American community with the death penalty versus those of the white community. Here in Virginia, African American population is about 14%, and America's death row is about 42% Black. So you're seeing an incredible experience, particularly since 1977, of almost all executions, something like 81, 82%, have occurred here in the South. And almost all of them are when the victim is white and the defendant is Black. In fact, in our 400 plus year history, it wasn't until 1997 that Virginia ever executed a white man for killing a Black man. 1997. And even then, it's only happened 4 times out of the almost 1,400 executions that have been carried out since that time. This is a profoundly racist institution.
Right, and it was also used back when the Supreme Court allowed you to use capital punishment for crimes like rape. That punishment was only ever used against African Americans. I believe there were over 50 African Americans in Virginia that were executed for rape. I don't think a single white person was ever executed for rape in Virginia. The most famous trial, I think, was the Danville 7, which I think a lot of people feel that most of those men were actually innocent. Each of those 7 men, I think, were convicted after a 1-day trial and pretty swiftly executed. So, there's a clear history in this Commonwealth that's not pretty.
Do you all see this, once it's enacted and the governor signs it, as really a significant turning point in the criminal justice system? Does it set Virginia out distinct from, let's say, other southern states?
Yeah, David, there's no question it sets us out among southern states. And, you know, it's an interesting issue to me because the death penalty doesn't actually affect a lot of people or a lot of cases. As I said, it's about one case every month that seems where capital punishment is sought, 60 some over 5 years. But out of all the issues bills I've worked on in the last 12 years, I've had a lot of people just reach out to me and say, you know, thank you for doing this. And I think a lot of people feel connected with it, even though it doesn't affect them, because a lot of people feel like having this on your books or not having it on your books says a lot about what kind of society you live in, about what kind of state you live in, about the values that your state and your society care about. And so a lot of people identify with it, even though it doesn't really affect a lot of people. And so I think it's really important to a lot of people in terms of how they feel about their community. And so I think it says a lot. And I also think it'll help, as Senator Kaine pointed out in his editorial that just came out yesterday, that it helps further the national discussion and the national movement towards dealing with this problem nationally. Because as a country, we're standing with countries like Somalia and Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Afghanistan. There's not another Western industrialized nation in the world that continues to do this. And as a country, if we see ourselves as leading the world when it comes to human rights and values, this is something we shouldn't be doing as a country.
You know, David, I couldn't agree more with Scott. The moral imperative that comes from abolition of the death penalty, I think, is, for me, a real motivating factor. And from when I speak to people, they don't tell me about the facts and figures that back this up. The fact that this is 88% of all people in criminal justice don't believe that this is a deterrent, that this is an ongoing issue. They don't talk about figures. They talk about what's in their heart and how they find this to be an immoral enterprise. And I think that, as Scott is saying, it speaks to people very profoundly. And I think we saw that in the debate in the House. I think we saw that in the debate in the Senate. People feel very strongly about this institution, for or against. And people feel very strongly about it. And so I think a lot of the discussion has been very thoughtful, but definitely very emotional.
Yeah,
I think my dog agrees with you too, Mike.
I think so too. I think so. Yeah. When you mention it being very emotional, I saw some of the debate in East Chamber, and for those who didn't, and those who would be listening to you now, what do you say to folks when some might say, well, that it's a just penalty, it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that some people deserve the death penalty, and then the argument that I've heard from some people that it gives the families of the person, say, who's been murdered, some peace and some end to the whole process. When it gets into that emotional part, and I know that, as you say, it's emotional for others on other sides of the issue too, but how do you answer that?
Well, I have a bunch of different things to say about that. First of all, with regard to the victims, you know, we heard during the process from several victims' families who basically said that stretching this out by another 10 or 15 years of appeals doesn't do anything to bring peace to them. It just continues the trauma. We also heard, and also actually, I don't know if Senator Janet Howell gave a speech on the floor where she talked about how her father-in-law was murdered and how the prosecutor in that case sought capital punishment, and it split her family right down the middle. Half her family wanted it, half didn't, and it created a huge amount of conflict within their family that could have been avoidable. Would also just note that with regard to the broader discussion, you know, capital punishment is often associated with a lot of different variables, like early childhood trauma. It's associated with people that often have low IQs. It's often associated with people with significant mental health histories. The case I referenced in Prince William County, where a law enforcement officer was killed on her first day on the job, the individual in that case had a significant PTSD problem arising out of his situations he'd encountered in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I think a lot of people, one of the reasons the juries don't do capital punishment as much anymore is because once they're made aware of the trauma that people have gone through and the different things that people have suffered through in life, and they understand the triggers that may have created a situation, they tend to understand the situation a lot more. Whereas people that are quick to judge about it haven't had the kind of trauma in life that I think a lot of other people may have experienced and have more empathy for.
You know, I don't think I could put it much better. I agree with Scott.
Well, before we would wrap up, or I would ask all the questions, Angel, did you have another question you'd like to ask our two legislator champions on this issue?
My last question is, I know capital cases can cost a lot more compared to non-capital cases. Can taxpayers potentially save money now that the bill is abolishing capital punishment?
Yes, absolutely. This is a profoundly expensive enterprise that takes sometimes decades. I mean, just the basic annual savings for Virginia is $3.9 million. And that's just the immediate cost of not having to have 29 people as capital defenders. There are going to be additional savings just for the lack of appeals that are going on. There's going to be savings for families, and that they don't have to be re-traumatized over and over again for a decade and a half. It takes, I believe, about 15 and a half, close to 16 years from sentence to execution here in Virginia. And that is an incredibly difficult experience for everyone involved and very, very costly. The costs that have been associated with death penalty are significantly higher. They're almost 70% higher than what it would be for a non-capital case. I don't want to ever talk about human lives and liberty in terms of money alone, but if the question is this cheaper? It is always cheaper to not have the death penalty.
Yeah, I mean, we probably spend, as Mike said, probably about at least $40 to $60 million a year. A decade, having this punishment available versus, maybe a couple million having people in prison. And I think if you were to ask anybody, should we take that kind of money, $35 million, could it be better spent? There's no question about that. But I don't really think a lot of people process the issue through that lens. But coincidentally, we're going to take, I think, a lot of the savings from that and probably use it for a public defender's office in Chesterfield, which is going to help provide enhanced defense to thousands of people. And so, there's lots of different choices you can make, and it is no question it's more expensive. I mean, the numbers that Mike threw out don't even include the costs that of having a judge having to focus on it, the clerks, the police officers. It doesn't include the expert witnesses. There's a whole bunch of other costs that aren't even wrapped up in the $3.9 million a year. It's an incredibly expensive process to have on the books.
Knowing how families can be split and family and friends can have different opinions, I would like to point people to a website that I found that I knew nothing about until preparing to have conversation with the two of you, and it's called Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. And it's a conservative group that started in 2013, Montana, then at CPAP, that conservative gathering, they formed that effort. There are state chapters, and we'll put that website up that if someone wants to see what conservatives say. Richard Viguerie, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, one of the leaders in that movement, says that this issue is not limited to bleeding heart liberals and crime coddlers, and talked about how conservatives have concerns too because of inefficiency, inequity, and inaccuracy. And I think that to me, that was some encouraging information, that it cuts across lines between those who would be liberal, moderate, or conservative, where conservatives are concerned about abolishing the death penalty as much as folks with other political views. Before we let you go, and I tell our viewers we're having a conversation on Saturday morning, the 20th of February, and I believe Delegate Mullin has a courts committee coming up later today that may be meeting, and then the General Assembly is still having meetings, and next week will be a key time on this legislation. So tell us what's going to happen the early part of next week.
Well, what I can say is that we are right now planning on having the final vote in the House and the Senate on Monday. And so starting around noon, you're going to see some final debate in both the House and the Senate. And hopefully after that, both bills will go to the governor and we'll hear a response from him. He's already pledged to sign them. And so I could expect that in the next 7 to 10 days, we will have abolished the death penalty here in Virginia.
We're not in court, but you have presented good cases on this. But any final thoughts that Scott and then Mike that you would have?
No, David, I mean, I think we've had a pretty robust discussion. I mean, I think the one thing we haven't talked about is sort of the complications associated with lethal injection. You know, it's become incredibly difficult for us to even administer that with to find the chemicals or to be able to find companies that are willing to give us the chemicals. And we've had to twist and turn our secrecy laws, our transparency laws all around to make them secrecy laws. And it seems to me that if there's anything that ought to have transparency, it's when a state takes a human life. All the other arguments, I think, you know, we've talked about pretty robustly. And I'm really proud my state is taking this step. You know, we've been having a lot of discussions within our caucuses to get our members comfortable with this. There's often trepidation when you start touching on issues like this. When you run for office, you know one of the questions you're going to get in a debate sooner or later from a constituent is, where do you stand on capital punishment? And you know, this is something that every elected official has to sort of reconcile and struggle with and take a position on. And I'm glad we're finally able to resolve this discussion in Virginia forever. It's you know, we're dealing with a lot of issues right now that we haven't dealt with, I think, very well for 400 years. And a couple last session, and I'm really proud of what we've been able to get done in the last 2 years. And I think this one is sort of caps it off.
You know, David, first I want to thank you for having us here today. Angel, thank you so much for guiding our discussion. I couldn't agree more with Scott. But the one name and the one idea that I want to leave you and your viewers with is a gentleman named Earl Washington.
Mm-hmm.
Earl Washington was an intellectually disabled man with an IQ of roughly less than 70. He was coerced into confessing to a rape and murder in Culpeper, and was at one point within 9 days of being executed here in Virginia. To our knowledge, that's the closest we've ever gotten to executing an innocent man. Later evidence from DNA proved that he couldn't have done it. And then additional evidence showed that his intellectual disability was the reason that he was overcome and confessed to something that he didn't have any part in whatsoever. He was later exonerated and commuted, and he is a free man today. But we almost killed an innocent man here in Virginia. That's not a philosophical, you know, possibility. That's a real human being who lives in Culpeper right now, who we almost killed. And he never did anything wrong.
We'll be watching as the bill is voted on and as the bill goes to the governor. Thank you both very much.